How's it going, guys? I hope you're all doing well out there today, wherever you are in the world. And in this video, I want to take you through some really cool features of the Boss GT1000 core that you might have overlooked up until now. Although I'm focusing on the GT1000 core, as far as I know, this is all transferable to the big GT1000. I was originally going to call it hidden features, but truth be told, they're not very well hidden. It's just stuff you might not have clocked unless you've gone deep into the manual, and we all know we prefer playing to reading manuals. So I think I've got 15 points overall, but there's some sub points, so we'll call it 15-ish. As always, guys, if you like this video and it's helped you out, you'd be doing me a tremendous favor by liking, commenting and subscribing, even sharing if you fancy it. It all helps push the channel forward and keeps me making content like this. So the first feature that may be simple to some, but I actually overlooked it for the first day or two of owning this unit because I didn't want to read the manual, is the input settings. Now, the GT1000 core lets you optimize the input level for your individual guitar. But on top of that, it also lets you save multiple guitars. So as you switch guitars, you can just change the guitar profile if you like, which is already optimized for the unit. It really negates any volume difference between the guitars. But also, when I discovered this and set it up properly, it really changed the way the amps behaved and interacted with my guitar. I was much more impressed with the unit once I'd done this. So to set this up for yourself, go into the menu, in and out settings and input. Here at the top, you'll see the individual profiles for your guitar. So I've set one up for the FGN, the Les Paul and the baritone. On the FGN here, I've zeroed it out. So that's how it would come as standard. Boss recommends if you want to set this up, turn off all the blocks so you've got a completely dry signal, turn up that input level until you hear clipping and then back it off. You can do that, but they also provide you with this VU meter here, which is really handy. And what I find is if you see this little triangle here, optimum for my ears is you're sort of tickling that triangle on occasion, but not consistently hitting it. So I would select the most loud position of your guitar with volume all the way up. So on this guitar, it's the bridge humbucker, and see where you are. So it doesn't need much adjustment, but I'd probably take it up a little bit. So to me, that is optimal, and it really does change the feel of the guitar. And as I say, you can set up multiple variations on that depending on your guitars and name them all accordingly. Next is the output menu. So if you go to the menu, in and out settings and output, you've got an output select and a global EQ. The global EQ, if we go into this, will give you a global equalizer over your main left and right outputs. As you can see here, it gives you a choice of which frequencies you want to boost or cut, which is handy for sculpting the overall tone depending on the gig or the room. And then you've got an output select. So what this will do is it gives you different profiles of units that you'd then connect your GT1000 core to. So for example, like the recording setting I've got it in now, that's because I'm running straight into my interface. It gives you a fairly flat response with cabinet emulation. If you scroll down to something like the JC120 return, it will sculpt the frequency response to be optimal for that particular situation, but it will also automatically bypass cabinet simulation. If you go down, you see they've got profiles for all the Boss amps, but they're more generic tube combo input or effects return, stack. So you can really dial that in, and that's really handy if you're turning up to a gig and perhaps not using your particular backline or your situation. As well as your main outputs, the GT1000 also lets you have a sub output. So if you go to the menu, in and out settings and the sub output, what this does is it gives you a completely different output to your main left and right. It lets you add a different cabinet if you wanted to. In this menu, you've got the same output select, global EQ, and you've also got an output level. So for example, if you were sending left and right out to the desk with your cabinet simulation, you could then use the sub output to send to a guitar combo on stage, be it the effects return or the input. It just makes it incredibly flexible. Now you're probably thinking the GT1000 core doesn't have a sub output, but it does, and we'll get to that in just a second. So the next feature is the effects loops. The GT1000 core has 2 of them, and they can be used just as standard effects loops. Send into the input of a pedal, output of the pedal into the return, and then you can engage and disengage that pedal from the GT1000 core and put it anywhere in the chain. But the effects loops on this are extremely flexible. So following on from the last point, the first additional feature you can use them for is actually assigning one of the sends as your sub output. To do this, you go to Menu, you go to Hardware Settings, you go to Other, and then here you'll see Send 1 setting, Send 2 setting. So you can set that up for the sub output, or you can even do it sub out aux mute. And what that is when you set the effects loop up in the way we're going to talk about in a second, you can also use the return as an auxiliary input. Another really cool feature within the effects loop is to use it as a branch output. What this will do is anywhere in the chain that you place it, it will take the signal and send that out of the send jack of that effects loop, but then the signal will keep flowing through the rest of it. So that's great for tapping it at some point in the signal path. Say you wanted to run a wet dry rig, so you can tap it after your distortions and things. Or if you wanted to take a direct output to a DI box, anything like that, it's really flexible. And all you do is place the effects loop, switch the effects loop on like that, and then go to mode and go to branch output, and that will turn the send into an output from that position in the effects chain. Another handy feature of the effects loop, if you were using it with a pedal, is a direct mix mode. And what this will do is it will let you take the signal out, process it through your pedal and bring it back in, but it will also give you a dry path as well. I imagine this will be especially handy for bass effects where you want that dry blend on pedals that don't otherwise have it. The next feature I want to discuss is the divider and mixer block. So as the name suggests, it divides the signal path and then mixes it back together. So you will have seen it in the standard configuration on the GT1000 where it splits between 2 amps. You've got a divider at one end there and then the mixer at the other, blending it back together. And you can use this for a number of simple things like splitting the signal into 2 paths, running both paths simultaneously. You can use it as an A/B switcher between 2 paths. The mixer block lets you blend that back together and decides with the balance or the level of each path, also if it's mono, summed or stereo left and right. The really fun stuff happens at the divider block, and what this will let you do, as I say, is a simple A/B or a splitter, but there's 2 really creative uses for it. The first one is dynamic switching, and that's what I was using for the intro sound. I've got one clean path with a tremolo and reverb, and then I've got a distorted path with a delay. As my picking dynamics get louder, it will duck the clean amp and bring in the distorted amp. To set this up, if you come over here, you want your splitter set to dual, your divider set to dual. And then you see here dynamic polarity. That determines whether as your picking dynamics get louder, it introduces something or it ducks it out. So I've got the minus, so it ducks out the clean amp. And then I've got plus, which brings up the distorted amp as the clean amp ducks out. And then you can set the sensitivity, so how loud your picking needs to be to make that happen. I hope I've explained that well enough. And that was the sound in the intro. So you've got nice clean tremolo. And then as my picking gets louder, it brings in the distortion. And the really cool thing is because that division happens at the start, the delay carries over from the distortion amp over the clean. Using the dynamic switching again, I've come up with something else quite cool. So if I go to the effects manual here, I'm using exactly the same principle, but using only one path. So if you see here, the dynamic sensing is off for the bottom path, which is a dry path, and it's on for this path at the top. And what I've got up here is an EQ, a vibrato, an echo, and a reverb all set to 100% mix. So when I play quietly, there's no effects at all. And then when I pick hard, all those effects are introduced and they spill over into the clean sound. So set up like this. Just wait for the trails. So if you're creative with your picking, you can pick out certain notes that really catch that effect, and then it turns off again. So I think that's really smart. So the other creative way of using the divider block is to actually create a crossover point. So you can send all of your high frequencies on one path and all of your low frequencies on another. While this is probably more applicable to bass, I've come up with something quite cool for guitar. So if you go into the effects path here, you can see I'm set to a dual mode. And then one side is set to a high pass filter with which frequency it crosses over at. And one side set to a low pass with which frequency it crosses over at. So what I'm doing here is for the top path, I've got a fuzz and a flanger. So that's everything above 500 Hertz. And then everything below 500 Hertz, I've got a compressor and an octaver. So you've got a nice clean lower octave and then a fuzzy flangey thing on top. And with that all engaged, it sounds like this. So the next feature is these front panel knobs that you see here. Now you can see the names above them and the values of them. What you can actually do is reassign any of these knobs to any parameter within the GT1000 core. And then it gives you hands-on access to the things you're most likely to need to tweak in the heat of battle. To do this, you go into the menu, you go into hardware settings and knob, and here you see the assignment for each of those knobs. If you want to change it, press enter. It gives you all of the blocks here. So I can pick reverb and then scroll down and pick the tone, say, of the reverb, for example. And then as I go back, the reverb tone is here and I can tweak it on the fly. Obviously, this unit's quite small, so if you were gigging this in the heat of battle, you might be worried about knocking any of these. Boss have really cleverly added this feature called lock. All you do is press these two buttons and it locks all of the knobs here and you can't accidentally tweak them unless you want to. Then it's very easy. You just hit it again. You can make your adjustments and then lock it again and no foul play happens. No surprises. The next feature is what Boss is calling Stompbox, and what this essentially is like a favorite button for individual blocks. Once you've found out what you like, if there's a particular setting on a delay or a distortion that you really like, you can save it as a Stompbox, and then that's a favorite that can be recalled really quickly within any preset. So to do this, you go to the effects chain and say, I really like this fuzz, this 60s fuzz I've dialed in. What you do is come over here to Stompbox, you click it, and as you can see, there's already like preset ones that Boss have already included. You press right to Stompbox, you can change the name and the location where you want to save it, and then that's instantly recallable in any presets that you want to create. The next thing I want to talk about briefly is the switching of the GT1000 core. You've got the 3 buttons on the front. You can also add 2 2-button foot switches or 2 individual expression pedals. Now, as standard, you can have a memory mode here, which lets you switch up and down and gives you control. But you can also switch to manual mode, which then lets you switch on and off individual effects. If you're in memory mode, obviously as standard, this is bank up and bank down, but you can actually change that to anything you want. So on the patches I've been working on, I normally make them turn on and off different things. So if you go to the menu, control assign and control function, as you can see, as standard is patch decrease, patch increase, and DS1 toggle on and off. I can change this to literally anything. So got like a delay tap tempo, I can bypass or engage any of the blocks, DS1 here, distortion 2. And once you've decided what you want for these 3, you can then go ahead and do the same for your control 2, control 3, control 4, and control 5, which are your external foot switches if you've got them connected. Then you've got your expression pedals as well, so you can decide what they control. Once you've decided what you want it all to do, if you go back one and go to LED color, you can change the color that comes on as you change through what your selections are. So that's really handy on gigs to keep you in the know of what's going on and what color you relate to certain effects. So the next feature I want to talk about is the patch limit. So as standard, if you're in memory mode, you can scroll through every preset that the GT1000 core has to offer. If you would prefer, you can set a patch limit so you only have a certain amount available to you. This would be especially handy if you have, say, 3 sounds that you use on a gig all the time. You can just assign one button that will cycle through those 3 presets and give you other things you can do with the buttons that remain. So to set this up, you go to menu, you'd be here as standard, navigate across to play option, and then you've got patch extent there. So at the moment I can go all the way through the GT1000. You can set the exact window that you have available to you, and you won't get into any presets that you don't want to. Next is the assign matrix, and to be brutally honest, this is an episode all to itself. I could probably go in for 20 minutes on this, but I'll just give you the brief explanation. I've shown you how you can reassign these buttons on the front. Well, that's only scratching the surface. If you go into menu and then control assign and assign settings, you've got a whole assign matrix that lets you basically assign anything to anything. This is where, for my previous presets, even though I'm pressing a button, the light's coming on and I'm, say, bypassing the distortion, what I can be doing in the background with this assign matrix is increasing the reverb mix, for example, or lowering the delay mix, or toggling any number of blocks on and off. So if you see here, the switch will let you decide whether that's active or not. The source will be where that trigger is coming from. So obviously you've got the pedals on the front. You've also got expression pedals. Then you've got a mode, whether it's toggle or momentary. You've then got the higher and lower values of it. There's so many features in here, but what I'm saying is don't rule it out when you're setting up how you control things. There's a lot you can do in that menu and you can really just play with it. But like I said, it's a full episode. I will probably get to it in the very near future. The next feature is the wave pedal, and the way to think about this is like an internal LFO or like an automatic expression pedal, if you want to think about it like that. And what it does is it will control in real time any parameter or number of parameters within the GT1000 automatically. So it will sort of modulate that knob in real time. To set this up, if you go to the menu, control assign, assign settings, here you'll see that assign matrix like we had before. You switch one on and pick something. So for this one, I want to control the speed of the phaser in the preset. So I need to find effects 1, little bit of scrolling, phaser, and then I want to pick the rate. So now that's selected. That's my minimum maximum value. If you go over here for the source of the controlling, you want to select wave pedal and set it to momentary. So rather than toggling on and off, it'll be a continuous thing. This is the low value and high value. If I then go over here, you've got the waveform. So triangle wave is as it suggests. Sine wave is the squiggly line. And then there's a sawtooth wave as well. So I'm going to pick the triangle wave and then the rate of which it moves that knob backwards and forwards. So there's a lot of creative uses for that. Obviously this is an extreme example, but there's a lot of creative uses. In a similar vein to the last feature, you can also assign that kind of thing to the input level of your guitar. So like if you've ever played an envelope filter before, it's the control voltage coming in from your guitar that's making that filter open and close. And you can do that to any of the parameters in the GT1000 core. Go to the menu again, control assign, assign settings. So you're back to where we were before. And instead of wave pedal, you select input. You keep the settings the same or change them depending on what you want to achieve. And then here instead we've got sensitivity, so that's how sensitive it is to your input signal. So you can hear as I pick lightly, the phaser is slow, and as I get louder, the phaser gets faster. And again, it's just another way to control your effects and get really creative. The next thing I want to talk about is the GT1000 core being an ideal candidate for 4-cable method. If you're unsure of what this is, there's plenty of info online, but it essentially lets you use your amp and then use the GT1000 both in front of it and in the effects loop. To do this, plug your guitar into the input of the GT1000, the send to the input of your amp, the send from your amp into the return, and then the output into the effects return of your amp. Then you can just insert an effects loop in the chain, and that is where your preamp will be located. If you want to get really crazy, the GT1000 core can actually run 7-cable method. So you'd have 2 amps running in stereo, and you could utilize both preamps and the stereo effects returns as well, using the method I described to wire it up, but using both effects loops within the GT1000. So whether you're running this 4-cable method, 7-cable method, or you've just got an amp in the rig, what they've also managed to squeeze into this tiny box, which is unreal, is amp relay switching. So you can use the foot switch functions of your amp and control it from the GT1000. All you do is connect either a mono or a stereo jack to the Control 4.5 jack on the left-hand side of the pedal. Stereo if your amp's got 2 functions, mono if it's got 1. And then what you do is you go into Menu, Hardware Settings, Amp Control, and then you can decide whether the relays latch, pulse, or they're inverted, so always open, always closed. And then to engage them, for example, you could set up this pedal to do it. You go to, not that one, Control Assign, Control Function, and then I've got it set up for Amp Control 1. You just go into the menu, find it, and then that will engage and disengage the function on your amp, for example, channel switching or reverb switching. Another feature that they've included that is super handy for a gigging musician is the ability to lift the ground. So you can lift the ground on the output or the send and return, which is really handy if you're running 4-cable method. Sometimes you run into a ground loop, but also in certain venues, things are just a bit crazy. So to do this, you go to the menu, Hardware Settings, and Ground Lift. And then it lets you individually lift the ground there on the send and return or the output. And you'll hear, if I do it here, it wants to see the ground, but sometimes if you've got that ground loop, it won't want to. So you can just switch those on and off, which is perfect. Right, lastly, they've even included a metronome in this. I know it's not the most glamorous thing, but it's super handy if you're practicing. So all you do is go to the menu, scroll across, and there you have your metronome with all the adjustments that you could possibly need for keeping yourself in time. So I think that about covers all of my overlooked features that I have found in the unit thus far. I know it was a bit of a long video, but there was quite a lot to cover. If there's any features that you use that I have missed, please list them in the comments below for other people to check out. Thanks for hanging out with me today. As always, if you like this video, please look at liking, commenting, subscribing, and even sharing. It really does help me out. I wouldn't be in the position I'm in and able to show off gear like this if I hadn't had the support already. More support means more gear, more content, and more nerdery. Whatever you're doing with the rest of your day, I hope it's great, and I'll see you again in another video soon. Cheers, guys.